Well, one of the quirks of my personality is that if I'm feeling a little nervous or lacking in confidence, then I get sentimental. But the one thing that I was never lacking in confidence or nervous about was my relationship with Masao and the importance of his work. So I hope I won't get sentimental. Rather, I thought I would just develop for you something that, returning to thinking about this conference and thinking about the work I've done over the last 5 years, I realized there was a certain theme that kept recurring. And it was a theme that I named a non-moralizing critique. A non-moralizing critique of capitalism, a non-moralizing critique of aesthetics, culture, non-moralizing critique of politics. And I thought what I would do then is try to articulate that here and show why Masao's work was so instrumental in really pushing me toward that. And I think it'll link up with a number of other things we've heard, Don talking about ethics, and Leo talking about Fukushima, which what I want to do is present to you what this non-moralizing critique is, show where it is in Masao's work, in particular that last piece he wrote, and the end of the last piece on literary elaborations, and then put it in the context of the Japanese disasters. In fact, last month I was in Japan, and I was not too far from Fukushima. I had made some films, and I was screening them in a place called Arabaki at a festival, which is really one of the worst hit areas of the earthquake and the tsunami. And then and it's about not too far from Fukushima, actually. And when I was there and decided to go, I was contacted by a architecture journal asking if I'd write something about the disaster, and I accepted. But when I got there, I realized that I had nothing to say, and there really wasn't anything more I thought I could say being there than writing about it at home in Toronto. And one day I was at a rest stop, and I was eating some food, and not too far from the highway, and I heard that unmistakable, unremitting electrical sound that is the signature of summer in Japan, which is the cicada, and the screaming of the cicada, or in Japanese, the semi. And it was at that point when I realized, oh, now I think I know what I want to write, and I put a title down, Semiology of a Disaster, toward a non-moralizing critique. And it's then when throughout the rest of that trip, I kept hearing in one ear the cicada, and the other ear Masao, and I can tell you that the cicada in combination with Masao's voice is enough to drive you crazy. Luckily, Masao always helped me or protected me, kept me from going crazy. And I asked really what would Masao's voice have to say about the disaster? What do the cicadas have to say about the disaster? Did they get injured in that area? Did they emerge? Did they not? And what's the relationship between the two? In fact, this summer the cicada around the Tohoku region came out late, and people had thought that it was a direct effect of the earthquake, the disaster, and the nuclear fallout. But then it was just shown to be an unseasonably cool spring, and then they came out, and it led one poet to write into the Asahi this haiku, "The semi are finally here. I'm sort of relieved, as things aren't quite normal these days." Things aren't quite normal these days, or maybe they're as normal as they've always been. At any rate, it's precisely during these types of days that I miss Masao the most, and I miss his voice that always cuts through the mediocrity and gibberish, as he would say. And so what I want to do then is show you how Masao, on top of everything else that we learned about him today and what he meant to everyone, is that he is also a great non-moralizer. To moralize is to impose a post-political value judgment on something. To judge something based on its immediate effect, the corrupt policy, that admirable act. To moralize the Japanese disaster, for example, is to focus on the bad leaders, the failed technology, the well-mannered victims waiting patiently in food lines, or even on the inevitability of disaster itself. A non-moralizing critique requires not just resisting this, but reframing the event in order to mobilize it toward a radically different future. And it's precisely this radically different future that has been missing in the debate around the disaster. Let me give you a few examples, both inside and outside of Japan. Some of you might know the work of Jacques Attali, who, student of Adorno's, wrote also quite a very famous economist in France, and he wrote a strident, blistering attack a couple months after the disaster, entitled "The International Community Must Intervene in Japan." And his argument was that it's so parochial and decision-making can't occur there in the way that it needs to, not just to protect Japanese citizens, but to protect really people throughout the world, that just like, and this was the argument Attali used, just like in Libya, an international group of experts needs to go to Japan and fix the situation. Well, as you can imagine, this generated a whole series of responses to Attali, which accused him of being culturalist and sort of finding some sort of unique, essential corruption in Japan that, of course, those criticizing Attali said, you should look at France and its abhorrent nuclear policies as well, and so forth. And you don't have to listen very hard to hear in this echoes of that debate, which we talked about earlier, the debate from the 80s and 90s, the heyday of the Japanese economic miracle, between the apologists and the revisionists and so forth. And the problem with that debate is the problem with the debate today. The problem with that debate between the revisionists and the apologists was that both sides waged their opposing arguments in terms of a similar and unchanging view of the future. The idea that somehow the future might not be radically different than the present, namely that capitalism might change or might not be dominant or might actually end, was never and could never be considered. So without leaving open the possibility of a radically different future, one can't help but moralize the limits of the present. It's at the very end, and actually I should say that the argument that Leo mentioned about Karatani Kojin is influenced by Masao as well. And in the summer, I was talking to Karatani about this, and if you read the article, what he's saying is, quite simply, saying, this is different than Kobe. Kobe was 1995. What happened? The earthquake and the disaster was mobilized to bring in all the neoliberal reforms in Japan and dismantle the welfare state. And people still didn't believe yet that the Japanese economy wasn't just in a sort of exceptional downfall, but that would recover. And for Karatani, what 1995 and the Kobe earthquake, about 5,000 people died, what happened then is people realized that, the economy is in serious difficulty, and now we need to do the reforms that are happening around the world. The argument then is what happens in 2011 is that there are no economic solutions within capitalism. Those aren't being thought about in the same way, and that's why Karatani's optimistic about something new that can happen. And I think this is really directly related to what ways that Masao was arguing later in his later pieces. Let me give you an example. At the end of Literary Elaborations, this is this really beautiful moment when he's saying, okay, it's not that the end of the world is going to happen. The end of the human species might occur. Let's say the science is right. Who knows how many generations, right? But other species will survive. The planet is going to survive. And so the great question then would be, what would be a human legacy to the planet, to other species? And it's not a defeatist mode, but in fact it's precisely by thinking about that type of question, by not moving too quick to sort of light switch of false hope that we get from so many academics in particular, that in fact something can shake up in that darkness as long as you continue sustained critique of the situation itself, which is what Masao, I think, is thinking about in that particular piece. And let me quote you from it now. He says, for now, I think maybe Stefan, or I can't remember who said this, but let me repeat it. For now, a new kind of environmental studies will need to decide whether human extinction is worth thinking about. At this time of very little hope all around, we can at least look forward to ongoing life on Earth, and as long as we entertain any hope, we'll manage to find the courage to keep going. This statement, I think, perfectly illustrates the principles of a non-moralizing critique. So now I can be vulgar, like Masao would be at times. First, a non-moralizing critique is not personally directed. It's not personally motivated. Of course, it's always coming from someone, but what must always be bracketed is that particular focus on that greedy individual or that particular outside to the situation itself, not to the exception of a larger systemic critique. Second, a non-moralizing critique must be wary of false hope, as I just said, while retaining a revolutionary consciousness. Third, a non-moralizing critique must recognize that crisis occurs in capitalism, not because capitalism has gone wrong, but because it's gone right, meaning that all of the inequality, all of the injustice occurs not because it's exceptions, but because it's operating just as it's designed to work. And connected to this then would be a fourth principle: one should therefore not be incredulous, not be surprised by the injustice and by the inequality. Rather, one should just be disgusted by it. I think Masao really embodied that. He would never be naive. He would never be incredulous. And fifth, this critique must always keep the future open. So now in terms of the Japanese disaster, we could argue that the earnest impotence of former Prime Minister Naoto Kan, or even the deflection of the TEPCO, the Tokyo Electric Company spokesperson, is not the opposite of the sincerity of the anti-nuclear activist, but connected to it within the structure of capitalism. Likewise, alternative energy, thermal, solar, is not the opposite of nuclear energy, but they're connected within the same system. Here's the point. When we only think about the minority emerging dominant within the same system, the dissident becoming prime minister, or green capitalism replacing dirty capitalism, then we're still trapped. And I think that you can extrapolate out into thinking about the role of intellectuals as well, that Masao did so trenchantly. This is not to argue that we shouldn't struggle for these reforms, but that this struggle must retain this type of revolutionary consciousness. And it's precisely this consciousness, not naive, not reckless, that I think Masao's voice always kept alive and always keeps alive. After the cicada emerged in Japan, it was revealed that near Fukushima, about 20% of them did have physical mutations. And it was at that point when many were worried that, of course, it was due to the radiation damage. But then it was quickly proven by some scientists that it wasn't due to radiation. Maybe it was due to corrupted soil from the tsunami. But in a sort of, I've got some good news and I've got some bad news way, the scientists were saying radiation damage will take much longer to manifest itself. We're not going to know if the cicada are damaged until 10, 15, 20 years into the future. The real political damage then of the disaster is that a future free from the logic of the present becomes even more difficult, even more impossible, if you will, to dream about, to act toward, at least when we remain within the limits of the present and allow these limits to colonize the future. But it's precisely this colonized future that a non-moralizing critique of capitalism and of the disaster attempts to liberate. This decolonizing project is precisely what I hear when I listen to the persistent ring of Masao's voice. And thanks to this conference, to Stefan in particular, and to all of you, we can now rewrite the haiku. Masao's voice is finally here. I'm sort of relieved, as things aren't quite normal these days. Thank you.